Hey guys, welcome back to the Uncommodified podcast and to another Uncork conversation. This one's going to be a brilliant one. Today, I want to welcome to the show Dave Loney. Dave, thanks for joining me today.
Great to be here. Thanks, Tim. Appreciate
Awesome.
appreciate the chance to talk to you.
It's going to be a great conversation. I can't wait to introduce you to my listeners, Dave. So, just as we start, just give a quick macro sense of the topic we're going to talk about. I'll introduce you, Dave, and then we'll crack things open. But what I'm going to braille out today with Dave, what we're going to tuck into is an idea that Dave and I have chatted about in the past. Dave has been chatting with people about this idea for probably his whole lifetime, but it's the idea of breaking free from the things that maybe sort of sit on us or bind us so that we can be our authentic selves. That is going to be the core of the topic that we're going to discuss today. And so just to give you a bit of history and background for Dave, I met Dave a number of years ago, and we've interacted on and off, Dave, in different environments. But for the past
Yeah.
30 years, Dave's been helping entrepreneurial leaders to be ultimately true to themselves and their uniqueness and their unique strengths, and to use that uniqueness and that truth to excel their careers. As a transformational coach and as an author, Dave's keenly aware of that sense of deep vulnerability in leadership that results from the pressure that comes from feeling they have to follow a subset of right behaviors that either society or their environments create for them, and the interplay between that and how that works on them personally. Dave's built his reputation around just a powerful sense of intuition. And I know I've experienced that, Dave. You are a highly intuitive person, but you marry with that intuition a great sense of candor, empathy, and an aptitude to build trust, collaborate deeply, and deliver practical wisdom, which is really important because some people are wise, but not very practical. And the one thing I would say about you, Dave, is you've been able to translate that wisdom, that deep wisdom, with a practicality, and that's where the rubber meets the road. And I really appreciate that. And I know other people who have worked with you and encountered you, and it's something that I know that they would say of you as well. And so that
Hmm.
brings you sort of over this 30 years. But in 2019, Dave also founded something called It's Your Lead Masterminds for the purpose of increasing the impact of his work. And that idea is all around designing and facilitating things that will powerfully catalyze the collective wisdom of authenticity, inspire talented entrepreneurs to accelerate their business growth, but also their personal growth. And I've had personal experience with Dave going through some assessment a number of years ago, Dave. I remember sitting with you and Bonnie
Hmm.
Lindsay in a coffee shop, I think in Guelph, and you
That's right.
unpacked. It was like you were reading my tea leaves. I did an assessment with you, I remember, and we got together, and I remember you started off by saying, "Would it surprise you if I told you this about yourself?" And I was like, "No, it doesn't surprise me." "Would it surprise you if I said this?" I said, "Yeah." "Hold on, you've been talking to my wife, Dave? How do you know all this?" And that's the power of that intuition and the tools that Dave uses. So that's the conversation we're going to crack into today. And with that, every great Uncork conversation for me starts with a drink. And so, Dave, we're going to have a coffee together this morning. And so, cheers to
That's
you,
right.
sir.
Cheers to you.
I got I got my coffee and I'm ready to go.
Awesome.
Awesome. That's good stuff. So, all conversations start with a coffee and a question. Questions create a great container for the conversation. And so, as we tuck into this idea of breaking free to be our authentic selves, I know when you and I were chatting before, we talked about an idea that you used the term social bias, and that's where I want to start our conversation today. So, what is social bias, and how does it affect us? That's where I want to start the conversation, Dave.
Oh, great. Awesome. Well, there's a bias that is, or a a, des- a kind of a collective expectation
Mm,
from people, from groups of people, where they expect a certain set of behaviors. And there's a bias to what behaviors are more effective. And these behaviors, this collective bias, is in organizations. Generally, when we get together in organizations, uh, and uh, and it's and there's averages. Psychometric assessments, good ones, actually understand this bias. And often when we're answering these tests that you do, you're actually answering towards potentially this bias, this expectation of who we're supposed to be based on our understanding of socially what we're being asked to be. And so, to give you an example of that social bias from an organizational perspective, leaders, be direct, be friendly, be trusting, um, be quick in decision making, um, etc. There's a number of these. Be focused, and these are biases, organizational biases, and they also show up in churches. They show up in schools, and they impact our because we want to belong and we want to be successful. For many of us, they can impact who we choose to become.
Hmm. So if I understand correctly from how you're unpacking that, so that social bias may not be good or bad in and of itself. In a sense, it's amoral. I mean, the things you just
Yeah.
described are not bad in themselves, but if I'm understanding the way you're framing that, is if I am becoming that for an inauthentic reason, then that's the problem underneath that. Is that really what we're getting at?
Yeah, I think in the early years of our life, we become who we are without actually considering it. Um, we're impacted by our environment. And this is the nature nurture debate. And I don't know that it's being debated as much anymore. Sure, it's being debated, let's be honest. But I see it as very clearly both. And so there's a natural propensity that we will have coming into this world, a way of kind of slots in our brain that are ready to be a certain type. There's you've had kids, I've had kids, and very early on, we see the differences in these kids. And so there's a natural propensity, but a lot of these things are shaped and formed before we're actually considering them. So to
Hmm.
say it's inauthentic is actually to say that that initial choice was something that we actually decided. But the first 6 years of our life, we're in a dream state. We're in a hypnotic
Hmm.
dream kind of state where what we are so willing to accept what we're told or what we see or what we interpret that we see based on others' interpretations for us. And I think that's where it all starts. And I think ultimately then it's realizing that after that, there's a number of experiences where we make choices. And how do we make those choices? Why do we make those choices? Good questions. And then ultimately, how does that impact how we decide that we're going to show up? I know in my story, very interesting because as I look back on my life, and I've spent a lot of time looking back and frankly looking forward as well, saying, who do I want to be? As I look back, many of my choices were because I needed to survive. And
Hmm.
so I had to reach to certain beliefs, behaviors about what I thought I needed to be, what I thought I needed to become to get through a pretty rocky childhood. And so ultimately, if I continue to carry some of those beliefs with me, that can impact my authenticity because, if fear is in the root of that, then I may be actually being motivated by something that is actually causing me to be different than who I really am or who I really could be in future situations, and that can impact my authenticity. So it's individualized. I think it's a very individualized question
Hmm.
that has to be addressed, as opposed to kind of a global answer. Yeah,
Okay. No, fair enough. So,
yeah,
so
yeah,
this bias that we have, or maybe
yeah,
the organization have that we're part of, or the family that we
yeah,
have, the biases that
yeah.
we have, how does that effectively does it create like a bit of a map that we start to follow? Does it map something in us? Um,
Yeah,
and if so,
yeah.
what's the impact of that?
Okay, I was thinking, a great question. When you go to the mall and you don't know where the store is, and you got to
Yeah.
find that, and you've got to find that, and
Yeah.
firstly you got to find it, right? And that's the hard
Yeah.
thing. Oh, there's the info booth, and oh nope, that's an advertisement. I'm sure they put them somewhere behind all the ads because you end up looking. Anyway, you find this map, and it's like, okay, find my store. Where do I want to go? Where am I here now? And
Hmm.
how am I going to get there? And in the same way, we create these maps in our mind, these orientations around what is, around where we are, around where we want to be. And these can solidify in terms of our beliefs about ourselves, our interpretations about the world that we're in. And this becomes kind of our perspective of how
Hmm.
we see things. So, uh, it's and sometimes we can lose track of those things as well. But these are largely become a subconscious underlying way of seeing things that impact our behaviors. So um, then these drive us. So these mental maps are kind of behind the scenes, orienting us through our lives. And sometimes they're worth considering because sometimes maybe they're not quite detailed enough to actually help us out the way perhaps they could be helping us out.
It's interesting as you use that analogy and we talk about that. I'm juxtapositioning in my own mind the difference between a maze and a map. And a maze, a maze is something that's it's easy to get disoriented and stuck in.
Yeah.
And I know in my own experience, my own life experience, at times, I think the thing that I thought
Mm.
maybe was mapping out the right way became a bit of a maze that I got lost in and confused in. So it's a really powerful image. And I would just say to our listeners as we're talking
That's
about this,
cool.
as we're having this conversation today, ask yourself not about the theory or the theoretical nature of this conversation. What does this practically mean to you in your
Yeah.
personal life, in your professional
Sure.
life, in your family?
Sure.
Because that's where where this conversation will really have meaning. But as you talk about it, I'm thinking, I think I have some really good maps in my mind, and I think I have some really bad maps. I think I've got some maps that have become so confused that they become mazes I've got stuck in, like one of those little lab rats running around after something to try to figure it out.
Yeah, and it's funny when you use the word maze because I mean this is just a play on words, but I went to the word amaze and
Mm-hmm.
being amazed. And when we're in those mazes, when they're in those difficult situations that we don't find our way out, I mean, one of the things that's I think important to grab onto is that's pretty amazing that
Hmm.
we actually are in an experience where we can't find our way and actually being honest about that and being willing to adventure through that confusion
Hmm.
and try this channel and try that channel, try this doorway, try that doorway, knowing that there is an outside to this, but
Hmm.
sometimes we have to try again and try again. I mean, that's part of the journey, right? And we've got to accept that.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
as you
it's
talk about it, no,
mhm.
it's powerful because I think I am an experimenter by nature.
Sure.
And I'll give you an example. My wife, for instance, who's an amazing person, fundamentally much more amazing than me in many, many ways, but she's not an experimenter in the same way. And frankly, that's created some tension for us over we've been married 35, almost 36 years. But over our life together, it's created some tension because I'm an explorer. I'm happy to get out and explore in the
Yeah,
middle of something I don't quite understand. Where for her, she really wants that figured out and understand exactly where things are going before she can set out on some journeys. It's a very
sure.
different way of looking at the world.
That's right. That's right. And so these maps actually create expectations of what the terrain is going to look like or is supposed to look like. And if we could be disoriented with our own maps and kind of go in the wrong direction, go back to the mall analogy and forget which direction we're heading. But we could also say, no, this is the way across this territory. This is the way around that mountain. And I have a particular way of doing it, and you have a particular way of doing it. And as a result, sometimes those expectations of our own selves, which have been mapped in us, can create potentially some conflict with someone else's way of doing something. And it takes a lot of great conversations and acceptance of each other and our uniqueness in order to say, well, they both can work. But let's figure out how to support each other in that process. Yeah,
No, 100%. So let me
yeah,
ask you, as you talk about maps and you talk about expectations and you talk about all these things and we talk about social bias. So the thing that comes to my mind is, so how does affirmation, the need for or lack of need or whatever that looks like, how does affirmation play into this can it become problematic and how does it intertwine in this
yeah,
conversation?
yeah. Great question. I think so. Affirmation is a form of energy. It's a way that we get something back from the people around us or from the environment, and it kind of says, "Good job." And this is important because that those kinds of words will build confidence. But before I go too far into that, let's kind of talk a little bit about energy itself, or in the context of our psychology, psychological energy. And in talking about that, we need energy. We burn energy. We burn calories. Our brains burn way more calories per pound than our bodies. And so psychologically, there's this energy equation. And what brings us energy? Think about that. You mentioned passions already. When we do what we love, we get energized just because it's a passion. It becomes like a need for us to do what we love to do. And and so that's one way of getting energy. Another way of getting energy is affirmation. What do we get affirmation from though? From our strengths, from those
Mm.
things that we bring to the world that we're good at. And we want to hear we're good at them. And that helps us develop our egos, our sense of self. When we say, okay, this is my strength. This is what I'm good at. Do you see that I'm good at that? Do you affirm that that's true for me? And so, great. I now say I've tried this strength on. I'm looking in the mirror. You're giving me feedback, and here we are. I'm getting that positive affirmation. So now that's energy coming in. Here's when it becomes an addiction, in my perspective. Strengths burn energy. Strengths
Mm.
don't give us energy. And so when we do tests about our strengths, good stuff. I mean, by the way, there is bias in that test because in these tests because we're saying what we want to be seen as. And that's our coachable direction. But now we're getting feedback saying we're becoming that. Great. Now, if that's the form of energy that we're getting and the only form of energy that we're getting, we can then be dependent on feedback more than we can be dependent on who we really are. But now we're getting into
Mm.
something very different. Who are we really?
Mm.
So I'm going to change. Feel free to ask a question, interrupt me at any
No,
time. But I'm going to
no.
change the analogy up, mix it up here a little bit. Think of a
Yep.
tree. Think of a tree out in your backyard. And let's go with a maple tree. And the leaves on the tree are the strengths of that tree. So in the spring, the strengths emerge. And what do those leaves do? They point themselves towards the sun and they get feedback from the sun and they photosynthesize. And what do they create? Sugar.
Mm.
That sugar is energy that feeds the tree. And so I see affirmation as sugar. It's a quick hit of energy.
Mm.
But have you ever seen a tree in the summer and the leaves are turning brown and it's
Mm-hmm.
the sun shining? Well, what is that? I'd say that's more of a root issue. It's not getting water. Maybe it's had too much phosphorus. Maybe it's in the wrong soil. Maybe it's been transplanted. And the roots are having a struggle. Under the surface, the tree needs something very different. It needs to be in the right environment so that the strengths emerge. And so if it's all about just the leaves, well, that's not going to work. That tree has to be
Mm.
planted in the right environment. So as human personalities, we actually have an more innate or early life expectation or development of what we expect the world to be like, what we will thrive, what environment we will thrive in. And so that environment that we thrive in becomes unconscious and becomes below the surface. And those needs, those root needs, give us energy as well, a different kind of energy. It's rooted, it's grounded, I
Mm.
am where I am, I'm solid, I'm firm. And I can handle the wind blowing. And even if I lose my leaves, they'll grow again because I know who I am, right? These strengths have fallen off, whatever happens. And so when the leaves, when our strengths start turning into stress behaviors, when they start to be stressed, that's a root issue. We're looking for a different kind of energy. We're looking for an environment that's going to give us something that we're not getting. And so what happens is, from my perspective, in the work that I've done, I've met many leaders. They're addicted to the affirmation energy. They're addicted to the energy that comes from their strength, and they run so far away from their needs, as I did run
Mm.
so far away from that environment that is part of my true self that I'm actually planting myself in a place to get the feedback, but forgetting about, okay, who am I really? And as a result, I'm moving into stress. And those stress responses, I'm trying to feed them with energy from affirmation. So now I'm in stress working for affirmation. And you know what that feels like. I don't know if you know that what that feels like, but I sure do, Tim. Have you ever been there?
Oh yeah, I've been there.
Where it's kind of like I'm gonna discipline myself, show my strengths, give me affirmation. Oh, stress behaviors show up again, and there's this kind of cyclical dance that goes on between feeling good about what we're doing versus uh, kind of feeling this dissonance, this stress response that's kind of creeping up inside us. And very often that's because we have a very different unconscious set of needs that we have to pay attention to. And so, just to put that in very practical terms, how many of us say we're extroverted on tests, but are truly introverted people? We're introverts that act like extroverts. And so, if all we do is put ourselves in extroverted situations to be the consummate networker and go out and get the passion for persuasion, the talker, the presenter, and get the feedback from the presenting, but don't take care of the introversion, the need to be alone, the need to be with one or two close friends, the need to dial down and think and read and those sorts of things. If we don't do that and just run around being addicted to being on stage, what can happen? We can burn out. We can start to overcompensate with the energy that comes from the affirmation.
And again, this is one of these intuitive moments. I think you're reading my tea leaves here, because as you describe that,
Huh.
I know that I have been susceptible and been in that cycle you just said. And a lot of people, I laugh. My children laugh often. My son, who I do a lot of work with, and we do some
Yeah.
podcast episodes together. We laugh because a lot of people, when they meet me, have a certain assumption of who I am and what really drives me. Because
Yeah.
I am that guy who can command the room and do all of those things, and I get a lot
Absolutely.
of affirmation from that. But I have very few close friends. I would much prefer to sit at home at night and do nothing night after night with my wife. I am not a social person in that aspect. And a lot of people get confused by me, because it seems like such a juxtaposition. Because on one level, if they've encountered me here, they see me as a certain person. And fundamentally underneath that, my root system is different. Like what I'm rooted in,
Yeah.
what I'm grounded in, and what really gives me life is very different than this thing. And I also know how I can get addicted to the sugar rush that
Yeah.
comes with that affirmation. And unfortunately, also people tend to pay for the production of leaves. Like like when you
That's
look at
right.
what you
That's
do
right.
for a living. So you can see
Sure.
this. It's a powerful analogy, Dave, and I know you've done a lot of work around this stress, strength and stress and burnout, and I imagine this has been something you've been exploring for many years, based on your own experience and the experience
That's
of
right.
many key leaders you've worked with.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, Tim, wonderful words. I would much prefer. How many of us will say that? I would much prefer. But yet we don't necessarily know how to do what we would much prefer. Or we feel stuck in being what we're expected to be. And I'm not saying we can't be what we're expected to be. And we have to make those choices. But those often can be either disciplines or what I would also say, I call it passion locked stress. When the
Mm,
passion for persuasion, the passion for teaching, and the stress that naturally fuels that cycle because of the addiction to affirmation, the only way to get the energy, can lock us into that cyclical pattern and then keep us from really answering those questions around what's my preference? What do I
mm,
really want? How do I really come alive? And how do I tap into that source that is going to therefore fuel this ability to be in these strengths? It's not that you have to say, oh, I can't be that way. And
right,
so it's not inauthentic to be on the stage if you're an introvert.
right,
It's a strength. It's developed. It's the real you, but it's not necessarily the whole picture of all of who we really are. And I think sometimes we can confuse those things. And I think that's one of the reasons we run out of gas is because we don't know what our gas stations really are. We don't necessarily plan how to get that deeper energy that we need and take care of ourselves in that respect.
Yeah, very powerful. And again, if you're listening in the conversation, just ask yourself, first of all, why are you listening today? I mean, that's the first question.
Yeah.
Why are you listening today? Because I think there's a
Yeah.
reason. And maybe you're listening because this conversation is really important for you at this moment in your own personal, professional life. Why are you
Yeah.
listening? What does it mean to you? How can you apply this? How can you think more deeply about this when this ends today or you press stop because you're tired of it? What else are you going to do with this idea? That's my challenge to you. So let me ask you just for one idea. So if I'm going to break free from this affirmation addiction, can you give me one just practical idea or something I should explore if I'm going to begin to look at that, Dave?
Oh, it's to me, it's phenomenal. I I mean, here's the idea, and I think it's a very powerful idea, and it's about stress behaviors. It's about recognizing when the leaf on that tree turns brown, it's telling us something.
Hmm.
Now, a botanist will know that tree is turning brown because it's that leaf is turning brown because it's let's say it's a fungus on the leaf. That leaf is turning brown because it's too much phosphorus. It's getting burned at the root level. So stress behaviors tell us about our needs. That's powerful. We
Hmm.
try to avoid our stress behaviors, and as kids and young adults, we're taught that stress behaviors are wrong. And we're taught to discipline ourselves away from those stress responses. We're taught and we're shamed away from the stress responses. And and this being vulnerable about what we're really feeling is actually we're willing to explore that stress response and what it's telling us. Stress responses, generally speaking, 80% of the time point us to our psychological needs. So when you're
Hmm.
saying I would much prefer when you're in stress, that's likely very true. And it's worth journaling about, it's worth becoming aware about, and then saying, okay, if that's true, how do I build that in? And so stress responses tell us about our needs. Now, there's tools that can do a good job in inferring those and bringing those to life and making that job easier that are really, accurate psychometric instruments. But that to me is a helpful thing. When you feel stress, and it's like darkness, the dark night of the soul, or
Hmm.
that what's that? The self that becomes darker. I wrote it down. A shadow self. When we
Yeah,
do
the
shadow
shadow. Yeah.
work, the shadow work is actually a teacher,
Hmm. Yeah, and
and
it's something I've
and we
explored with a lot of my guests.
yeah
This idea of shadow seems to keep coming up. I think
yeah
it's a message for me.
yeah. It's a good teacher, and yeah. So I think that's something
Hmm.
that I've learned is to honor the stress.
No, for sure. Hey, so Dave, I'm going to do something. I'm going to sort of take a little departure from some of the original questions I was going to ask
Sure.
you, and I'm going to do this because I think I'm at a moment in this conversation that I want to explore. Whether my listeners want to explore it with me, they'll decide. But
Wow.
so
That's
let me ask you this, and I'll make this very
sure.
personal for me. So
Sure.
one of my stress behaviors, we'll call it, if I'm tracking with you, is over my lifetime, and although I'd say it's more contained today than it has been in the past, is I have struggled with a stress response of anger at times that's just fairly explosive.
Mm.
Um, I would say I maybe even go as far as say maybe sometimes it's become rage for me.
Wow.
Um, and I've been conditioned over my life to say that's evil, that's bad, that's not somehow it's not me, and sort of separate it out and say that's my job is to kill that thing or somehow I don't know what I'm supposed to do with it. But when I feel it, I initially feel like I'm just pushing it out and saying, well, that's just not who I am. But I guess first of all, it is who I am. I get that's the
Yep.
reality.
Hmm.
But my question to you is if that's a stress riser for me, if that's an example of
Hmm.
what stress looks like, what's
Hmm.
that pointing to me? And if you were coaching me as a leader, as a person, as a man about that, what would you be asking me to start exploring?
Well, thank you. Great question. And you're talking about my life here as well, which is why I wrote the book Sweating from Your Eyes, Emotional Fitness for Men. Back in 2002 to 2004, I took 10 years of my journal entries dealing with my rage and, and was scared stiff about raising kids with that kind of thing going on. And I went to my mentor um, and I said, how do I raise kids and not put on them this, it's a fear response. Anger is a secondary emotion. It's a fear response. It's something's not working. It's an uncomfortable feeling, and because we're feeling uncomfortable, we feel we have to push back. And there's things called the amygdala hijack, and when we kick into fight or flight or freeze, those sorts of things, and we stop thinking. And so, I could look at the physiology of this and say, Tim, first thing you need to do is breathe, and cool down that amygdala and take some time to think, is this real, and become aware. Different issue though. I was taught to discipline myself and not to be angry. But all that did was make the problem worse. I was the kind of guy that in the middle of an argument, I'd get so uncomfortable with myself, I'd leave the room because I didn't want to be who I was becoming. But then I
Mm.
turn right back and run back into the room and continue the argument, and it would escalate and get worse. And then I feel worse about myself and start beating myself up. And then, of course, more drain. So I get the picture. The book kind of addresses this. Um, it's interesting because what we're talking about is over assertiveness. When we're angry, we tend to, and there's a scale in terms of assertiveness. Um, some of us are very assertive people. I tend to be an assertive guy, high on the scale of assertiveness, and you likely are as well. And so But for me, that's a strength behavior. Assertiveness is a strength behavior. My need is very different, but it's very confusing. My
Mm.
need is uh, autonomy, is freedom, is give me space to make up my own mind. Don't push me with your idea. Let me accept it if it's good for me. Don't yell at me. Don't be assertive with me. So I actually have a very low need for assertiveness. And so what can happen, well, what's interesting about this is, for me in this particular case, when I feel uncomfortable, what is my stress behavior? I become more assertive. So now my assertive strength becomes even more assertive. And both of those behaviors are hiding my need, which is dial this down, please. Can we have a calm, quiet, more spacious conversation that gives me choice? Both those behaviors are lying to me about my need. So the assertiveness score is a more challenging one when we're looking at it, because some people need assertiveness and they can become more argumentative in order to say, give me the debate. And some people become more assertive to protect themselves from the feeling of discomfort. I'm looking to
Mm.
protect. And so it's important to ask yourself those questions. And some people just lose their assertiveness and become uh, freeze or flight, and they hide and they go quiet. And that's an individual who likely needs autonomy, and their stress behavior is telling them exactly what they need. So assertiveness is a little bit of a more complicated one to unpack, but I hope my story helps you in that. I'm telling you my story as opposed to trying to coach you in the moment here. But what
Yeah.
in that particularly resonates with you, if you want to share that? Because
Yeah.
I
So
thought it
as
was
you tell
safer to
your,
share my story than
yeah.
have
Well,
than dig into yours here.
Well, listen, I'm a pretty open book, and my listeners will know that. So,
Yeah.
this podcast is probably more about me getting therapy than anything, Dave. I don't know what it is, but listen. First of all, your story is my story, as you describe it. I resonate with that story.
Sure.
And
Sure.
also, when I had children, I began to have these thoughts, and I actually began to seek some therapy for myself back then at that point, because I recognized that I didn't want to go forward with my children and imprint them in the same way I was imprinted from my own past
Exactly.
in
Sure.
this particular area. So, but as you describe it, I'm really having a clear understanding, and where I need to do some work, where I need to do some good mind, heart, and soul work is what is my need. And I would say honestly, I'm not really great at identifying that. I
Sure.
haven't disciplined myself, not disciplining the behavior, but discipline myself to ask myself, what am I really in need of right now? And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm
Mm-hmm.
hearing what you're saying. I think for me, the journey starts, and I think this behavior has changed over the years. It's become more muted in some ways,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't mean
Mm-hmm.
it's gone. And so
Mm-hmm.
I need to ask myself, the next time this occurs to me, I need to be able to ask myself, what do I really need right now? And how do I become better at articulating to myself first and then
That's
to
right.
others what I really need here? And
Right.
that that's a great orientation point for me. So what do I need right now,
That's
understanding it
right.
myself, and then
Right.
being able to articulate what I need to someone else, to my children, to my wife, to a colleague, to a customer, maybe even, because we have frustrations even in our dealings with our own customers at times, where
Sure.
and we have to unpack that. But
Yeah.
understanding there's a need piece here, and that it's beyond the behavior. It's really about what I'm deeply needing right now that's
Yeah.
driving that.
That's
That's a
right.
really powerful
That's
idea,
right.
and I appreciate you
That's right.
encouraging me around that, and also
Yeah.
sharing your own
Yeah.
story, Dave. I appreciate that.
Yeah, yeah, then that's great. And this awareness of need is important, and the willingness in this context to say, okay, I know, yeah, and you can do the work in the context of assertiveness by saying, okay, I just that happened. I'm starting to feel this way. What's going on? And try on backing off the conversation. Try on just dialing it down. Try on asking for some space, or try on getting into the debate and see how you feel. Does the discomfort increase or decrease? Um, and there's also the tool that I use called the Berkman method, which dials into that pattern of assertiveness, and that's where I learned it. When I wrote my book, I was teaching about discipline. I was teaching about don't do that to your kids. Think of the damage you're going to create for your kids. Don't be that way. Stop it. Like that. I don't know if you've ever seen the video with that
Mm.
comedian who, stop it.
Yeah.
Well, hold on. How? Well, no, it's about getting the need met. But we have this language around needs that they're selfish, or that, I'm supposed to put others first. Well, I don't know, in the event of a plane crash, we got to put our own mask on first. I'm not talking mask,
Hmm.
but yeah, I'm
Yeah.
talking we got to get our own oxygen so that we can help others get oxygen. And so this to me it's a very important thing to have to learn to know what are my needs, what are my root needs, and how do I access them? How do I request them? How do I stand up for them? How do I do that in a healthy way versus an unhealthy way? The stress response is the unhealthy way, but
Mm.
it still
No.
teaches us, right?
Yeah. No. You
Yeah,
know what? It's instructive. I think it's Ben Franklin said. I think he said,
yeah,
if it hurts, it instructs. So
yeah,
it's an opportunity inside there. So listen, we're gonna bring this conversation in for a landing in the next couple of minutes. But before we do that,
sure,
you just mentioned something, and I just want to tweak on that. When we talked about maps, we've talked about
yeah,
mazes. You just talked about a good mask, an oxygen mask. But
yeah,
here's my question: is so this idea of mass, the unhealthy ones, because you just made a differentiation, healthy, maybe unhealthy, a healthy mass, an oxygen mask when you need it. That's good. But
right, right,
how does the mass that sort of we create or others create for us, either in life or business, how does this interplay to this thing for us? And if we are maybe putting on a mask or a facade or a masquerade or whatever we want to call it, how do we understand that, and how do we take them off in this
yeah,
process? Because I feel that struggle sometimes, and I feel like
sure,
sometimes I've created a mask for myself that I wear, and sometimes I feel like others have created it and said, hey, this is what you need to look like, and they put it on you, and sometimes it's really hard to get it off. How
yeah.
does that play into this whole thing, Dave?
I think that largely depends on who you are. I'm going to overclassify things here, but some of us are WYSIWYGs. What you see is what you get. And I can remember in my early days in sales training, after I stepped out of accounting, which just clearly wasn't me, and moved into sales, um, that that we were taught that mirroring someone else's behavior was the way to connect with them. And so that's assuming everybody is a what you see is what you get. Everybody is acting the way they want to be treated. It's not true. Some people are. Some people their needs are very similar to their strengths. An introvert who acts like an introvert, a person who is more controlling in stress and doesn't like change and is very good at creating systems. Great. There's a what you see is what you get kind of behavior. But some of us, our behaviors are very different than our root needs. And I call that fit emits. You know what fit emit means? This is the term I
Mm-mm.
came up with. I want to make a T-shirt with Fitimit on it. Fake it till you make it.
Hmm.
And I think there's a power in faking it till you make it. There's a trying on of behaviors, and it can be healthy, but it can also get to the point where this faking behavior becomes more of our identity. And we learn to, like, it's back to that addiction issue. We learn to receive the affirmation from the faking behaviors. We learn to feel better when our mask is on than when we're being our authentic selves, because we are individuals who have been very adaptable, and we've moved a long way from our root needs. I call that a run from or a run to. For some reason, we've run from something. I didn't want to look like my father. I ran from looking like my father. And, but I was a lot like my father in many ways. A lot of the good characteristics of him, I was a lot like. And I ran from that to become somebody different. And in that difference, I became quite a fake it till you make it guy. These are ultimately strengths for me, but those strengths only show up when I care for myself. If I don't care for myself, they're overreaching. They show stress responses. They're uncomfortable. People, I believe people can see right through that mask. And so it's not, and then the work is about integration. It's about saying, I accept these parts of me that are strengths that may have been masks initially, but now they're strengths. I accept that, but I'm going to healthily display them because I'm going to care for myself. And then the strengths will emerge out of my self-care, as opposed to because that's what I have to be, because that's where my ego, that's where my sense of self resides. And that's when it becomes, I believe, unhealthy. And frankly, that's the work we need to do. When things get dark, when things gets difficult, that's when we need to open our eyes, keep the lights dim, and learn to see in that. Learn to explore it, learn to be curious about it, and then start to understand what it's telling us and learn more about ourselves.
Hmm. No, and first of all, Dave, just brilliant ideas. I really appreciate that. It's so helpful for me. So let me ask you a question.
Thanks,
If
Tim.
somebody wanted to connect with you and explore this conversation in a different way for themselves,
Yeah.
how would they hunt you down, Dave? How would they find you?
Well, my name is Dave Loney, Daveloney. And my website is daveloney.com. And on there, there's a free copy of the book I wrote. It's not the whole story, though. It doesn't get into needs. I got to write something different, but there's a lot of good books out there. And it's a way to just learn my story and see if it resonates. There's also the It's Your Lead mastermind groups, which are growing quickly because they're working well. Authentic conversations with other men. And we're soon starting authentic conversations for women groups as well, with some good women facilitators. So it's a way to explore. I think understanding this isn't a quick fix. It's a conversation we all have to be willing to have. And those are some of the tools that I'm offering right now. So I thank you very much for asking, Tim. I appreciate that.
Awesome. And listen, I would just say again, personally, just to you as you listen today, again, ask yourself why you're listening. What does this mean to you? And I know from my very little experience, not a lot of experience with Dave, is an authentic human. He is who he is. He's becoming what he desires to become, and he has a
Mm.
way of helping others do the same. And I just want to encourage you that if you feel that Dave could be helpful to you in your personal or professional journey, the
Mm.
ideas that he's sharing, the things we've talked about, please hunt him down. So, listen, as we sort of bring this to a landing here, Dave. Obviously, this podcast is called the Uncommodified Podcast, which is for me all about releasing that uniqueness of who we are, our authentic self, if we want to call it that today. And so, my question to you, as it is to every one of my guests, is that when Dave is being the unique Dave Loney that only Dave can be, bringing that unique contribution to the world around or to the group of people you're with, what is Dave doing that is uniquely authentic to him, that is bringing that impact? And by the way, if you hear in the background, that's my dog Jackson barking upstairs. And for those of you who listen on a regular basis, Jackson makes an appearance in a lot of my podcasts because he likes to. He for some reason when near the end of the podcast he likes to start barking. So if you hear him, that's the dog Jackson. So Dave, when you're bringing that unique contribution, what are you doing that is that uncommodified best expression of Dave Loney?
Thanks. I'm. I would say at the a gut surface answer is open and curious,
Hmm.
willing to see differently, willing to change. But I think at a deeper level, I love connecting. I love I love deep friendships. I love honest conversation. I love accepting others and being accepted and for who I am right now. And I love that journey. And so that to me is kind of my motivation for the work that I do. It helps me come alive is having these kinds of honest conversations. It's part of my root needs is deep conversation. And so I think yeah, I hope that fairly answers the question.
No, and again, it's a unique answer to everybody, and I love
Yeah,
it. You're
yeah,
uncommodifying yourself when you're curious, open, and having these authentic conversations with yourself, obviously first, and others. And that's
sure.
powerful. So, listen, as we finish up, I'm going to give you an opportunity just to challenge or encourage our listeners about anything you want, Dave. I'm going to give the floor over to you. How would you like to challenge or encourage the people who've chosen to listen, who've taken,
Oh,
some of their time they'll never get back to listen to us today? How would you want to encourage or challenge them as we finish?
um, yeah. And I thought about this. I was in one of my mastermind sessions the other day, and one of my members said the following, and I called him up. I said, Ross, can I ask you if I can have permission to say what you said? And is this your quote? He said, yeah. He said, we've given away our present to the past. Shall we also give away our future? And I've been thinking about that, and I thought, wow, that's interesting because our present to the past, what is that? You know, to me, I interpret that as our gifts can be given away earlier in life. We can actually give away our gifts. We can actually say, no, the gift of who I am is not going to be me. I've given away my gift to the past, to the experiences that I've had, to the challenges I've had, to the way I was raised, to this belief that I have about myself or about others that is getting in my way, to this thing that gets me stuck. I've given myself away to that. Shall I also give myself away to the future? No. No, many of us have work to do to bring that gift to the world, and we can still do that. And so I encourage you to hang on to that kind of reason, that why you are here, to discover that why, and to say, that's possible. It might take some work to get there. It might take some deeper work, but it's still possible. Don't give your gift away to the past. Give it away to the future.
Hmm. Great encouragement, and I really appreciate that. And again, Dave, really appreciate your time today. Joe, so generous with your time to come on and chat with me and my listeners today. And so, as we finish up, here's what I'd like to encourage you to do. If you listened in today, again, you were here for a reason. You listened for a reason. Do me a favor. Email me at tim@theuncommodified.com or connect with me on social media and let Dave and I know how you're uncorking all this, how you're applying it, how you're deciding what it means to you. And when you do, let us know what that's looking like and how you're experiencing it in your authentic world as your authentic self. Have a great day, and thanks for listening.